November 1943, 27,000 feet above Dresden. The temperature outside the B-17 Flying Fortress registered 42 degrees below zero. Technical Sergeant Roy Keller pressed his frosted oxygen mask tighter against his face and strained to hear the faltering rhythm of the No. 3 engine. The high-pitched whine of the supercharger had changed pitch 3 minutes ago. Now the entire airframe shuddered with each rotation of the propeller. Keller glanced toward the pilot, Lieutenant Daniel Hawkins, who nodded grimly at the failing engine. They both knew what was happening. At this altitude and temperature, the oil was thickening to the consistency of cold molasses. Soon the bearings would seize, and they'd lose another engine over enemy territory. It was the third such incident in 2 weeks for the 385th Bomber Group, the latest addition to the long list of technical failures that the high-altitude daylight bombing campaign had produced, mechanical failures that killed just as efficiently as the German 88s below. No. 3's going critical, Hawkins reported over the intercom. Everyone brace for shutdown. As the aircraft shuddered again, Keller looked out at the failing engine, watching the propeller's rotation slow. They had 15 minutes before they'd have to drop out of formation. 15 minutes before they became easy targets, a wounded animal trailing behind the herd. The cold of the upper atmosphere had claimed another victory, not through a pilot's error or a German gunner's skill, but through the simplest law of physics. Oil thickens in extreme cold, and in the history of aerial warfare, it was the forces of nature that often proved the deadliest enemy of all. The problem of oil viscosity at altitude had plagued bomber crews since the B-17s began their high-altitude missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines that powered the Flying Fortresses were masterpieces of American engineering, but they had been designed and tested primarily at lower altitudes and in moderate climates. Standard military-grade lubricating oil, SAE-50, performed adequately up to 20,000 feet. Beyond that, the extreme cold of the upper atmosphere, often reaching 60 degrees below zero, caused the oil to thicken dramatically. Viscosity increased exponentially with each degree of temperature drop. By 25,000 feet, the oil sometimes became so thick that it couldn't properly flow through the narrow oil galleries to critical bearing surfaces. The result was a deadly cycle. The superchargers, essential for maintaining power at high altitude, created intense heat in their own bearings. When insufficiently lubricated, they would begin to fail. Their failure would cause engine power loss, forcing pilots to drop altitude, making their bombers vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. The 8th Air Force had lost 18 B-17s in the previous month to engine seizure at altitude, not from direct enemy action, but from the unforgiving physics of petroleum distillates in extreme cold. Engineers at Wright Aeronautical had been working on the problem for months, experimenting with different oil formulations. They had tried introducing alcohol additives and various dilution methods, but nothing provided a reliable solution. Technical Sergeant Roy Keller had witnessed the problem firsthand during 3 consecutive missions. Each time, they'd lost at least one engine above 25,000 feet. Each time, they'd limped home on reduced power, vulnerable and exposed. He had taken apart enough seized engines during his 18 months as a mechanic to understand the fatal pattern: oil starvation at the most critical moment, when the bomber was deepest in enemy territory. Meanwhile, back at Nettishall Airfield in Suffolk, the mechanics and ground crew chiefs worked through endless nights, trying everything from preheating the oil to adding specialized anti-freeze compounds. Nothing seemed to provide consistent protection against the murderous cold of the upper atmosphere. Staff Sergeant Thomas Weston had never intended to be a flight engineer. Before the war, he had been a short-order cook at a diner in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His experience with machinery had been limited to fixing the occasional broken refrigerator or temperamental gas stove. But the Army Air Forces had their own logic when it came to assignments, and Weston's aptitude tests had somehow qualified him for flight engineering school. Now, after 14 missions, he spent most of his time monitoring the temperamental Wright Cyclone engines of their B-17G. And like every other engineer in the 385th, he'd developed an intimate understanding of the oil freezing problem. On December 7th, 1943, while the squadron was grounded due to heavy fog, Weston was helping in the mess hall. The regular cook had fallen ill, and Weston's pre-war experience made him the natural replacement. As he prepared breakfast for returning night crews, he noticed something peculiar about the cooking oil. "I was heating up the fryers when I realized something," Weston later recounted. "The kitchen oil stayed fluid at lower temperatures than our engine oil. It had that slightly yellowish tint, but it poured like water even when it was cold." That night, Weston smuggled a small container of kitchen oil from the mess hall to the maintenance hangar. Working by flashlight, he compared the viscosity of the kitchen oil to the standard Wright R1820 engine oil at various temperatures. Using ice from the mess hall's refrigeration unit, he chilled both samples to near freezing. The difference was immediately apparent. While the engine oil became thick and sluggish, the kitchen vegetable oil maintained a remarkably consistent flow rate. It was a property of certain vegetable oils that had been known to food scientists but had never been applied to aviation. Weston approached Technical Sergeant Keller with his discovery the next morning. "This is crazy, Tommy," Keller said, examining the samples. "We can't just put cooking oil in a $1 million bomber engine." "Not as a replacement," Weston explained, his voice low as other mechanics worked nearby. "As an additive, 5% kitchen oil mixed with our regular oil, just enough to change the viscosity curve at altitude." Keller rubbed his chin. "The brass would never approve this. It violates at least 6 technical orders." "And how many crews have we lost because their engines seized at altitude?" Weston countered. "We're not asking permission to try it on the whole squadron, just our aircraft. Just once." The risk was enormous. Using an unapproved oil additive could result in court-martial. If it damaged the engines, they could be charged with sabotage. But the alternative was continuing to watch planes drop out of formation over enemy territory, becoming easy prey for German fighters. That night, while the rest of the base slept, Keller and Weston carefully drained 5% of the oil from each of their B-17's 4 engines and replaced it with the kitchen vegetable oil. They worked methodically, mixing the oils in precise proportions, their hands cold in the December air, but their movements deliberate. "If this works," Keller whispered, "we'll have to tell someone eventually." "And if it doesn't," Weston replied, "we'll both be flying a desk in Alaska." The next morning's mission was a deep penetration raid to Schweinfurt, target of the infamous October raid that had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers. They would be flying at 28,000 feet, precisely the altitude where engines had been failing. December 10th, 1943. The target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The mission required a 4-hour flight at maximum altitude over heavily defended German territory. Passing 25,000 feet, Lieutenant Hawkins announced, as their B-17 climbed in formation with 19 other bombers. Technical Sergeant Keller watched the engine instruments with unusual intensity. Oil pressure gauges for all 4 engines remained steady as they passed through the altitude where problems typically began. Outside, the temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero. 27,000 feet, came the call. This was the critical threshold where oil viscosity had caused previous failures. In the cockpit, Hawkins and his co-pilot exchanged glances as they noticed something unusual. While other B-17s in their formation were adjusting power settings to maintain position, their engines seemed to be running with remarkable consistency. Oil temperature holding steady on all 4, Weston reported from his engineer's station. Pressures nominal. The bombing run proceeded without incident. Their B-17 maintained position perfectly throughout the approach to target. When they reached the initial point and began their bomb run, Lieutenant Hawkins noted that their aircraft alone seemed free of the power fluctuations that typically plagued the formation at high altitude. After bombs away, the real test began. The return journey would take 3 hours, more than enough time for engine oil problems to manifest if they were going to. But hour after hour, the modified oil mixture performed flawlessly. At 27,000 feet, when the number 3 engine of the aircraft flying beside them began to falter and lose power, their own engines continued to run perfectly. The crew watched as their companion aircraft dropped out of formation, descending to a lower, more dangerous altitude. "Whatever you did," Lieutenant Hawkins said to Keller over the intercom, "it's working." When they landed at Kennettishall, their B-17 was the only aircraft in the formation that had maintained optimal power settings throughout the entire mission. The maintenance crew immediately noticed the difference when they examined the engines. The oil flowed freely despite the cold, and there was no evidence of bearing wear or insufficient lubrication. Word spread quickly through the maintenance section. The kitchen oil trick, as it came to be known, had worked where official solutions had failed. Weston's improvised mixture had maintained proper viscosity at temperatures that would normally have caused standard military-grade oil to thicken beyond usefulness. News of the successful modification spread through the 385th Bomb Group with the speed that only life-saving innovations can achieve. Within days, flight engineers and mechanics from other squadrons began to appear at Weston and Keller's maintenance bay, asking questions about the precise mixture and application method. Captain James Harrington, the group engineering officer, initially attempted to shut down the unauthorized modification. "This isn't approved by technical order," he told Keller during a tense confrontation in the maintenance hangar. You could destroy those engines." "With all due respect, sir," Keller replied, "we've already flown 3 missions at maximum altitude with 0 engine issues. The rest of the group lost 7 engines during the same period. The numbers were difficult to argue with." When Harrington examined the maintenance logs for Weston and Keller's B-17, the evidence was clear. Oil pressure remained consistent at altitudes where other aircraft showed dangerous fluctuations. By mid-December, an informal network had developed among the mechanics and flight engineers of the 385th. Kitchen oil was being siphoned from the mess halls in small quantities, just enough to create the 5% mixture that Weston had determined was optimal. The cooks, many with brothers or friends among the flight crews, became willing accomplices. Mess Sergeant Frank Donahue ran what amounted to an underground distribution system from his kitchen stores. "Every quart of oil I can spare might bring back 1 more plane," he told his staff. "We'll eat more boiled potatoes if we have to." The operation remained technically unauthorized but tacitly approved. Squadron commanders, facing constant pressure to maintain operational readiness, turned a blind eye to the unusual requisition patterns from their mess facilities. The results were impossible to ignore. Aircraft with the modified oil mixture were maintaining formation integrity at high altitude, while those without it continued to suffer engine failures at the same rate as before. By Christmas 1943, the kitchen network had expanded to neighboring bomb groups. A mechanic from the 379th at Kimbolton brought back the technique after visiting Nettishall on a parts exchange. The 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts, which had suffered particularly heavy losses, adopted the modification after one of their flight surgeons learned about it during a medical conference. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, deputy commander of the 385th, finally confronted Keller directly in late December. "This isn't regulation," he said, reviewing the maintenance records. But it's keeping my boys alive." He paused, then added quietly, "Keep doing it until someone with more brass than sense tells you to stop." The impromptu network extended beyond vegetable oil. At RAF Grafton Underwood, Mechanics for the 384th Bomb Group had begun experimenting with a similar technique using linseed oil obtained from a nearby furniture repair shop. At Bassingbourn, the 91st used a mixture that incorporated a small percentage of olive oil supplied by a local Italian restaurant owner whose son served as a waist gunner. By January 1944, the unofficial modification had become standard practice across most of the 1st Air Division, though no formal documentation acknowledged its existence. What had begun as Weston's desperate experiment had evolved into a grassroots solution to one of the most persistent technical problems facing the daylight bombing campaign. The mechanics kept meticulous records of their results, building an impressive body of empirical evidence. Different vegetable oils were tested and compared, with varying success rates. Corn oil proved particularly effective in the extreme cold of winter missions, while the olive oil mixture performed better in the marginal conditions of early spring. It was this detailed documentation that would ultimately force official recognition of the technique. When the 8th Air Force Technical Evaluation Board conducted its monthly review in January 1944, the disparity in engine failure rates between squadrons could no longer be attributed to statistical variance or maintenance quality. "Something's happening out there," the board chairman noted, "and I want to know exactly what it is." By January 1944, Weston and Keller had been summoned to 8th Air Force headquarters to explain their unauthorized modification. They expected severe reprimands, possibly even court-martial. Instead, they found themselves in a room with engineers from Wright Aeronautical and senior officers from the Technical Division. "We've analyzed your mixture," the lead engineer said, spreading charts across the conference table. "The vegetable oil contains natural polymers that prevent crystallization at low temperatures. It creates, in effect, a primitive multi-viscosity oil that maintains flow characteristics across a much wider temperature range than our standard formulation." The kitchen oil addition had not been merely a lucky guess. It had inadvertently pioneered the concept that would later become standard in aviation lubricants, multi-viscosity oil designed to maintain consistent flow characteristics across extreme temperature ranges. Within 3 weeks, a new oil specification was issued to all 8th Air Force bomber groups. The modified formulation, officially designated Oil Aircraft Engine Type C4, incorporated similar vegetable-based additives to those Weston had used. The official documentation made no mention of kitchen oil, referring instead to synthetic polymeric viscosity modifiers. Engine failure rates at altitude dropped by 64% in February 1944. By April, specialized additives based on the same principle had been developed and incorporated into the standard oil formulation for all Army Air Forces aircraft operating in the European theater. The technological impact extended beyond the immediate war effort. The principles discovered through Weston's improvisation led directly to post-war developments in lubricant technology. By 1947, commercial aviation had adopted similar oil formulations for high-altitude operations. The petroleum industry, recognizing the value of the discovery, began extensive research into synthetic additives that could provide the same benefits without the limitations of vegetable oil. After the war, the technology was refined further and eventually led to the development of modern multi-viscosity oils for both aviation and automotive applications. The W designations now common in motor oil ratings, like 10W40, indicate this same property: oils that maintain consistent flow characteristics across a wide temperature range. Staff Sergeant Thomas Weston received the Bronze Star for his innovation, though the official citation mentioned only technical improvements to aircraft operating systems. He returned to civilian life in 1945, opening a small diner in Tulsa. He never spoke much about his wartime service. Technical Sergeant Roy Keller stayed in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a Chief Master Sergeant in 1967. In his personnel file, a handwritten note from a commanding officer in 1944 simply stated, "This NCO demonstrates exceptional problem-solving abilities under adverse conditions." When interviewed for an Air Force historical project in 1982, Keller offered a characteristically modest assessment of their achievement. "We didn't invent anything new. We just noticed something that was already there and applied it where it was needed." That's all innovation really is, seeing the obvious that everyone else has overlooked. Air Force Technical Order 27R11, revised June 1945, contained a small footnote on page 83. Initial development of multi-viscosity lubricants resulted from field-expedient solutions developed by operational units of the 8th Air Force, proving once again that necessity remains the mother of invention in combat conditions.